Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Ryan Vest, executive editor of TNSR, and I'm here with our editor-in-chief, Sheena Chestnut Greitens. We're pleased to have joining us today a distinguished national security and China scholar, Jon Caverley, author of So What? Reassessing the Military Implications of Chinese Control of Taiwan, which is featured in Volume 8, Issue 3 of the journal. Jon is a professor of strategic and operational research and interim press director at the United States Naval War College. Both the articles and Jon's discussions today represent his views and do not represent that of the United States Naval War College, Navy, or government. Jon, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. It's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here, seeing you and Sheena, especially you, Ryan, my old shipmate from the Naval War College. It's nice to be working with you guys.
So, Jon, we're really delighted to have you joining us today on the podcast. I wanted to just open by asking you a little bit about the backstory behind this article. You start with kind of a provocative question, which is, so what if China takes Taiwan? And so I wanted to just invite you to tell us a little bit about how you came to write the analysis that turned into this article with TNSR.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll try to keep it short. It's a lengthy journey. I started out in this business as an international relations theorist. And then I was fortunate to get this position at the Naval War College, where I do more applied operational research. In particular, I work on the future fleet. What should the United States Navy invest in now in order to have the fleet it needs 30 years from now? Because shipbuilding takes such a long time and technology is changing so quickly. And so for the first time in my career, I was really getting down into the operational and tactical levels of security studies in a way I never had before. And it really made me think about what is this relationship between sort of operational analytical side of the coin and then kind of the more strategic sort of hypothesis, theoretical testing that we do in international relations. And as I was thinking about that, just kind of the discourse of what to do about Taiwan was kind of rising in temperature. And as I say in the article, there's a lot of plausible reasons to defend Taiwan. I don't go into the political or economic or moral reasons for that. I work for the United States Navy, so really I help admirals come up with the best professional military advice to civilian leadership. And so I really stuck to the military case. And it really seemed like a disconnect that at the same time, the balance of military power is really shifting unfavorably for Taiwan, and less clearly, but certainly plausibly, between the United States and the People's Republic of China. There was this increased emphasis on Taiwan as this pivotal military asset whose possession or autonomy really affects the entire balance of power in the Pacific and sometimes people say around the world. And that's a really big claim that requires a lot of analysis, and much of it has to be open source. It has to be at a high level of strategic thinking, because I think that's what a journal like TNSR and War College Review, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to bring issues at a very high level so that academics and policymakers can make big decisions. And so I started thinking about that and just doing some sort of open source analysis based on some really excellent work that's already gone before me to create this article that I was proud to publish with you guys.
That's great, Jon. You know, you talk in the article about how control of Taiwan would make less difference than maybe a lot of people think in the broader operational balance in the region. Could you walk us through the argument and what you think your operational assessment gets right that others might have missed?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really important and I think is underappreciated in both policy but also academic circles is the need for comparison. That's how humans learn. I often tell admirals in tabletop exercises, it's like going to the eye doctor. Is it better like this or better like that, right? You really can only talk about something making a difference if you have two things to compare it to. And so one of the things I was seeing is we just weren't comparing PRC-controlled Taiwan to the baseline of the status quo that we're currently working against. And then it gets a little ironic because when we think of the assets that China is developing, in part to take Taiwan militarily, if it has to, these are things that they're doing independent of Taiwan, right? So the ability to push United States naval forces far outside the first island chain, maybe even the second island chain, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion, right? That's a prerequisite for taking Taiwan. They need that in order to take Taiwan. It doesn't go the other way. If you take Taiwan, it doesn't necessarily mean you need that to push the United States Navy out of the way. And so that's the big kind of move I made with your help and the referee's help, was creating a baseline of the status quo of what is the power projection and anti-axis threat that China poses to the United States and its partners and allies. And then how does that change once you introduce systematically a non-autonomous Taiwan?
So let me ask you a little bit about the comparisons that are at the heart of the analysis here. You might be the first person, by the way, that I've ever heard compare kill chains to an eye appointment. So the next time I have to go get my vision checked, I'm going to be thinking about this article. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Well, since you do it once a year, at least, that's good. You'll be thinking about my article.
It's been more than a year, but sure. It'll definitely be in my mind the next time I go in. So you run 4 different kill chain scenarios in the piece, right? You walk us through 4 different scenarios to test China's ability to threaten the US military presence in the Pacific. And so, can you talk a little bit about why this is helpful for understanding Taiwan's operational value? And could you kind of explain the links, the find, fix, finish way that you break down the kill chain? Really, this is getting into kind of the core comparative exercise that's at the heart of the analysis. Can you walk us through that and help readers understand what these comparisons are and what they tell us about Taiwan's military value?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll try and answer it in 2 sections. One is sort of the method, and then one is the actual substance of the analysis. When you're writing a piece like this, and this is the first really operational open source piece I've ever written, it took me a long time to write. I learned so much doing it, is really injecting theory into a very complicated scenario, right? War is the most complicated activity you can imagine. We don't know what war looks like until it actually happens. Ukraine is a great example of this. But what you have to do as humans, we have to use theory in order to organize the complexity as something tractable that we can make a decision about, right? So if you had, an eye chart that looks like an Escher drawing, right? That's not going to work. You need an eye chart that actually is just a few letters that you're familiar with. And then you can go better like this and better like that. And so what I tried to do was take the many, many different ways we think of the chain of tasks you have to get to in order to decide you have to attack something, to actually attacking something, to assessing whether it was successful or not, and then reattacking, how to distill that into something that is simple enough that you can make that eye chart comparison and yet capture the most important elements of that decision. And hopefully, because, I'm a political scientist, I want to be cited and replicated. Hopefully this kind of approach, this simplified approach, this theoretical approach will be useful to other areas of inquiry. And so, after talking to colleagues and after reading a great deal and reading stuff by Talmadge and Green and Steve Biddle, we came up with this idea of the kill chain, right? And 3 links in the kill chain. So 3 discrete tasks that you have to accomplish if you're actually going to have a military effect on an opposition. And so the first 2 are find and fix. These are kind of sensing and tracking. So they're fairly distinct tasks. It was theoretically useful to break the sensing part of a kill chain into 2 components, because many things that are good at finding, which is getting a sense that a target is out there, maybe a bearing, maybe a rough range, a sense that's good for that is not necessarily optimized for the fixing, which is really getting a very accurate real-time position and a track that you can actually leverage a weapon for the 3rd link in the kill chain, which is the finish, right? And that's bringing a weapon, it could be kinetic, it could be non-kinetic, to bear on the target in order to take it out of operation. So it could be sinking a carrier, but it could also be just preventing it from accomplishing its mission, what the military calls a mission kill. And so by dividing those 3 things up, it actually helped me organize various capabilities that people associate with the current People's Liberation Army, and then what people are suggesting would be added by PRC control of Taiwan. And then you just look down the logic, and it becomes a pretty simple theory, right? It's every single component is necessary but not sufficient. If you can finish something, but you have no idea where the target is, it's not useful to you. And while knowing where the threat is sort of useful in conflict and competition, really, if you're trying to actually engage with the enemy, you actually need a weapon that can reach the target in time. And so then I basically started trying to look at which capabilities mattered the most. And I went to a lot of previous work that's been done. And then to answer kind of the second part of my answer to your question, Sheena, is I had started out by looking at Taiwan, right? So Taiwan was sort of the independent variable, right? Do I have Taiwan? Do I not have Taiwan? And as I thought about the status quo, and as I started reading deeply these arguments for the military value of Taiwan, it was very clear that the assumption about the availability of space really mattered, right? We often think of the United States military being completely dependent on space for our kind of exquisite sensing and weapons engagement capability. And that's certainly the case to a certain degree. But China is heavily reliant on space, especially for these ballistic missiles, the carrier killers, these Guam killer missiles that we hear a lot about, that we see in the China military power report. And so I realized that while most of the previous work had space as an assumption, so either all space goes away because of anti-satellite warfare, or everyone has space, so we just assume that everyone has this ability to use space for whatever they want. Sometimes it's something in between. You have to make that a variable. So ultimately, I have 4 scenarios because now I have 2 variables, right? I have the possession of Taiwan and the different assets you can put on Taiwan. That's one variable. And then the second variable is whether space is available. And this has a massive effect on the ranges and relative value of the capability that China currently possesses. And one of the nice things about the article and working with TNSR is working with your team, we developed maps that actually make this very clear. And that's as clear an eye chart as we can possibly get.
Yeah, I thought the maps were very effective at conveying that visually. So for anybody listening, would definitely commend the maps. They're very helpful in just giving that visual illustration of what the delta is and isn't. And that's an important part of the argument. All right, I'll stop. Ryan, back over to you.
So, John, I'd like to go a little bit further down this rabbit hole. You talk a lot about space and space-based capabilities as a critical enabler for China in this model. I was wondering, what did you find when you compared China's kill chain performance with and without space, and why is space so decisive?
Well, so again, it gets down to the kill chain model and the fact that everything is necessary but not sufficient. So we spend an awful lot of time talking about, and rightly so, these ballistic missiles that China currently possesses, not to mention the fairly long range cruise missiles that can be air launched from its bomber fleet, which is growing and becoming more sophisticated. But again, that's not enough, right? You have to have the ability to know where the target is, and fix to assign a target quality track so that by the time the missile gets to its target, which can be several thousand nautical miles, the target is still sufficiently known, the location is sufficiently known that you can actually bring the weapon to bear. And so basically, when you start systematically looking at the ways that China can use sensors to detect, for the sake of discussion now, an aircraft carrier, United States aircraft carrier, the collection of satellites that it clearly possesses, that is all, I've made sure to only use US government sources or US government authorized or endorsed sources for discussing sensitive things like Chinese space capability. They have a combination of satellites, both optical and electronic intercepts, to really have a very persistent coverage of the entire theater in a way that airborne radars, long range radars that are in the hinterlands of China, mainland China, they don't have that ability to both precisely fix and also find at long range. So once you if you magically remove all of China's space capability, you are then reduced to a much tighter range ring where you can actually bring your weapons to bear. And the seminal work on this is Biddle and Orlick in international security, which I use heavily, what basically said about 600 kilometers from the coastline is where you are likely to be able to have a good find and fix pair of links in order to bring a weapon to bear. So you're now shrinking your weapons engagement zone from several thousand kilometers to 600 kilometers. And then once you factor in, and the way Taiwan becomes implicated in this is that we have to understand that Taiwan is basically right off the mainland of China, and mainland China's coast is vast, right? So in terms of providing that additional sensing from airborne assets on Taiwan, it's extremely modest, right? It's just a couple 100 kilometers. And, the article has tables and it also has the maps that kind of make this very clear. And so that's the intersection. So Taiwan allows more short range munitions to be put to bear. So it bumps out the range, so you can put kind of shorter range, less expensive missiles and use that to push off aircraft carriers. But in terms of sensing, it actually doesn't have much of an effect at all. And that just makes it very clear that space has a vastly bigger effect on the entire kill chain because it is necessary but not sufficient element to find and fix.
So if I could ask a follow-up question on that, and I'm actually going to read a line from the article and ask you about it so that I make sure I get the wording exactly right. Given the scale and sophistication of this satellite program, China's satellite program, it seems likely that short of large-scale anti-satellite warfare, China enjoys a persistent ability to find and fix moving targets, meaning U.S. or allied target and partner targets in the Western Pacific. So, what assumptions are you making in the piece, if any, about the United States' willingness or likelihood of engaging in anti-satellite warfare in the event of some kind of military operation around Taiwan?
Oh, that's a great question. So I can answer that in two ways. First is I try not to make an assumption about political decisions, given that I feel I'm here to make the best professional military case for or against possession of Taiwan. I have an employer as the United States Navy. And so that's why I'm more comfortable talking of it as a variable that, let's say, a fleet commander or a chief naval operations can tell the civilian leadership, okay, well, here's what it's going to look like if you engage in anti-satellite warfare. Here's what it's going to look like if you don't engage in anti-satellite warfare. That's your decision, boss. You figure it out. It's really important to make that a variable. But then I also kind of did want to critically look at sort of the logic behind when it would be military valuable to attack either country's satellite network. And that's where you just kind of look at military doctrine, especially PRC military doctrine. And some of the analyses that makes the case, especially for the subsurface threat emanating from Taiwan, actually requires a very discrete amount of satellite sensing ability. So China can't have the ability to find a target, but it has enough satellite capability to fix the target. And because of that, it's this weird rheostat that you need in order to get the Goldilocks scenario just right, that submarines actually matter as a threat to aircraft carriers. And so then you start walking down the logic chain, like how do you get a medium Chinese satellite capability? And it requires restraint by the United States, which you could plausibly say that there are a lot of reasons why the United States would be very hesitant to attack China's satellite network. It would result in massive economic losses. It would result in massive damage to many satellites, not just the military ones, and would set a quite important precedent for the future of warfare. But when you actually read Chinese doctrine, and Sheena, I'll defer to you as one of the great experts on this, it seems pretty clear that China cannot conceive of a scenario when it is fighting an existential conflict against the United States where it doesn't go after what it considers the key enabler for American power projection, which is space capability. And so then you have to assume, well, China has to refrain from doing that because it'd be very implausible to say that, well, China will start attacking American space capability and the United States wouldn't reciprocate. That's how I would probably analyze that.
Thanks. I think that's a really helpful answer to draw out that the analysis really tries to present options and their probable consequences or possible consequences. So the decision makers who are faced with the decision, or hopefully not faced with the decision, but if they ever are, have the best tools to understand the potential consequences of the choice they're about to make. And I think to me, that's one of the real values of the approach that you take in the article. But that actually leads me into a question I wanted to ask you about that's a little bit outside the specific scope of this piece in TNSR. And that was just a question about what have you learned from writing this piece about what academic or open source modeling can contribute to these important debates? And, I guess the flip side of that is kind of how do you right size the role or think about the role of academic open source analysis, and maybe where can it go wrong, or what should we not be trying to do or infer from it?
This is a great question. It is one that I'm only beginning to wrestle with. I think it is going to be a central question for the profession of security studies going forward. And so given TNSR's position in the firmament of IR, I'd really like to know what you guys think as well. Let me start out with first principles. The first principle is it is fundamentally important that academics critically examine policy statements and policy plans and policy assumptions about war. Okay, this is a fundamental aspect of the marketplace of ideas that academics have to be involved in. And we have tons of examples, let's just say from the Cold War, right? Where the military says, trust me, we have access to exquisite sensitive information that I can't tell you. And we have access to analytical abilities that are far surpass your wildest dreams. So when we say this is the case, you're just going to have to believe us. And time again, the military is wrong. Some of it can be malicious, right? Militaries are organizations and they defend themselves, and politicians do what politicians do. Some of it is just, it's really hard to think about future war, right? This is a thing that we just don't understand. Again, Ukraine is a great example. And so one of my fundamental messages to many of my colleagues, especially junior colleagues, is it's really important to start thinking about the operational assumptions and how you can critically evaluate them going forward. Because we are talking about a really dangerous world we live in right now, where large countries with nuclear weapons are kind of getting in each other's grills. Now, having said that, what's the best way to do that, right? And there does have to be a division of labor, right? We have to kind of do what we're best at. And working at a place like the Naval War College, where I work with serving military officers, but I'm a political scientist, we see when we work with military officers, even very senior military officers, it's very hard to get them to move up from tactical to operational to strategic, right? And really, one of the things I think political science should do is actually start with the strategic and maybe go down to the operational. And that's for two reasons. First of all, inside the military, you're just not going to see a lot of strategic analysis. And that's for both kind of bureaucratic reasons, right? We're trying to justify what kind of ship we're going to buy. Generals and combatant commanders have to decide how to actually fight the war, right? And it's also civil military, right? It is not the military's place to really talk at the strategic level and start making value judgments. And so that's the division of labor that academics have to have. And that's the realm of theory, right? And that's the realm of simplification, as I was talking before. And so while I encourage my colleagues to dive into the operational, get familiar with the operational aspects of our business, I think we have to avoid the temptation that we have in contemporary political science, especially of what Mearsheimer and Walt famously called hypothesis testing, where you actually, let's just take the cliche of a data set, right? You have a data set of militarized disputes, and then you find a new factor, let's call it in my first book, capital labor ratio of the military. And then you say, well, capital labor ratio correlates to the following things in war, and therefore you write a whole book based on that little finding. That's not our strength, right? Getting at the particular, getting at that little independent variable is not something we have as academics have an advantage over the military. And so I actually think instead of getting down into the weeds of one little model about, underwater sound propagation, or how does a certain type of radar wavelength bounce against the ionosphere, that's important details, that's important anecdotes to support your case, but you really have to talk about the big picture, the big moving parts. And that's kind of where I see academic approaches to operations and modeling really taking place. And my inspiration is the big debate during the Cold War in the pages of international security between people like John Mearsheimer and Barry Posen and people like Cohen. and who was much more in tune with what the United States military was thinking at the time about the Battle over Fulda Gap. So if you look at the debates over that, which I encourage all our listeners to do, you'll learn a lot about kind of what the division of labor should be between academics and policy.
There's this common quote that a nation that has too big a gap between its soldiers and its scholars will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. And so one of the things we want is not for the discipline of security studies to all turn into members of the military, but to have an informed dialogue where each side understands the perspectives of the other and you can have a constructive exchange. So that's part of what we're trying to do, but I think also speaks more broadly to the role of security studies in the U.S. civil military arrangement.
Oh, Sheena, you're absolutely right. And I think that's actually something that I try to do at the review, and you're doing relatively successfully at TNSR, is it's not that we want academics and military officers to resemble themselves or do the same thing. It is more what is the familiarization with both cultures? How can we learn to leverage the strengths of both professions in order to make better policy? I think that quote is perfect.
Jon, I'd like to follow that thought up a little bit more. Something you make very clear in the article, and that we probably would be remiss if we didn't hit on a little bit more as we discuss this. You talk about how your article doesn't assess Taiwan's broader strategic value, its economy, its democracy, the symbolic importance. But given your findings that Taiwan's operational value to the military is relatively modest, how should that recalibrate the way that U.S. officials talk about Taiwan's importance and shape decisions about how far the U.S. should be willing to go to defend it?
Okay, that's the key question. Again, I really try to focus on the strategic effects of operational art, right? How do I help my bosses provide best military advice to political leadership? And so let's imagine, and I think I'm right, let's imagine I'm correct, that Taiwan actually doesn't have an operational impact either way for the balance of military power in the theater. And then the question is, I'm not recommending how one should feel about whether the United States should defend Taiwan against military coercion, but knowing that operational kind of insignificance, I do think if you decide to defend Taiwan, how to defend it is impacted, right? And so I go that a couple different ways. One thing I have experienced over the past few years working on this topic is, when you look at the day-to-day, you don't feel like we're learning much, and you can get frustrated with the speed of policy. But over time, you do see learning. And it seems like a much clearer case that any conflict with China, any military conflict, whether it's over Taiwan or South China Sea or something else, right? It's not going to be short and sharp, right? When it comes to sort of large scale wars between great powers, these things tend to develop over time, and they tend to become wars of attrition. And there's some really good work done by people like Josh Rovner and then people at CSIS and CSBA, the think tank world, on what does a prolonged conflict actually entail. And so one way I try to think about it is you don't want to destroy the operational balance between the United States and China. I try to think of the operational balance, right? And so the United States doesn't defend Taiwan, then our allies around the region are going to start thinking a reassurance is not credible. Now, that can be disputed, but that's not the point of this article, right? But if you think about credibility, like the ability to actually execute your military operations also matters for credibility. And so if you have a Taiwan that's autonomous after you defend it, but the entire Seventh Fleet is at the bottom of the ocean, and you have a Chinese maritime industrial base that has something like 200, 250 times larger than the United States is, that is not going to be reassuring to places like Japan and the Philippines. So then the trick is, if you want to defend Taiwan, you can't do it at a way that makes the United States less able to compete with China in a longer, more prolonged conflict or a wider conflict, what we call in Cold War the horizontal escalation problem. And so one of the cases I try to make is, rather than optimize the United States for one military scenario, especially when it comes to the Navy, because the Navy is sort of your Swiss Army knife of day-to-day political military operations, you can actually do your best to help Taiwan defend itself with American support. And there's lots of work being done on this, from Indo-PACOM to people like Steve Biddle and Eugene Goltz and Ben Friedman. This idea of creating a porcupine of Taiwan. This is a very famous article produced by my colleague Naval College, Bill Murray, a long time ago. You can do that and make the invasion of Taiwan as hard a problem as possible for the People's Republic of China, right? While giving more operating space and more mission space for the United States military for this longer, wider competition. So there's a logic often used to describe the importance of Taiwan. It's called the cork in the bottle theory. This idea that once the PRC has possession of Taiwan, it breaks up this thing called the first island chain. And all of a sudden, all these power projection forces can swarm out into the Pacific and start wreaking havoc. I talk about that in the article, but there's actually what some people call the psychological cork in the bottle theory, which is the idea that if China is obsessively optimizing the People's Liberation Army for this very specific task, which is a cross-strait invasion or an airborne invasion of Taiwan, right? It can't be focused on the other things, which we would care about for a wider or longer conflict. And so the way I put it is, we could build a military and a concept of operations that makes the invasion of Taiwan the pacing threat for China, which is very much in the United States' interest, but not making it the pacing threat for the United States and its allies, allowing the United States and allies to focus on that broader, wider conflict.
Well, I have a couple of questions that come out of that. I did want to loop back because I was going to ask you about this idea, this logic of Taiwan as the cork in the bottle, because you say pretty explicitly in the article, as you've just covered, that you think that's not the right way to think about Taiwan's role in the Indo-Pacific. But there's a second logic, a submarine tender logic that you talk about, that you also say isn't quite right. And so can you tell us a little bit about what's wrong with those mental models of Taiwan's value? And then I have another question about the pacing scenario that I'll loop back to.
Terrific. Well, there's a couple ways to come at that. I will start with two concepts that are really important, and then I'll give you a one-word answer to your question, Sheena. If you can think of two big missions for any military in this theater, one is called denial, right? And one is called power projection, or we would lump in sea control in with denial as well. So the ability to deny the United States carrier strike group to operate in a operationally relevant space for a Taiwan or for a theater-wide conflict, that's denial. So some people would argue that Taiwan actually helps extend the People's Republic of China's ability to deny space, air, and sea to the United States. And then the other one, which is the cork in the bottle argument, is this idea that Taiwan enables the flowing of forces for China to project power, the amphibious, strategic bombing, aircraft carriers, to actually create military diplomatic effects outside of the first island chain, right? And so, it's important to understand these are two different missions and they're subtly different. But to answer your question, what is it about this logic that has changed? It's missiles, right? So almost all of the discourse about the importance of Taiwan is actually dates from the 1940s and 1950s, right? The last time the Pacific was truly relevant militarily, the last time the defense of Formosa, now Taiwan, was really important. And you have these three distinct logics. These are the cork in the bottle, which is Admiral Ernie King's phrase, and that's the ability for power projection. And then the other two are more focused on the ability of China to deny, in World War II was Japan, to deny the operation of American forces far from the continental United States. And this is from MacArthur's very famous phrase, which is repeated over and over again. He was great for the one-liners. This idea of Taiwan as the unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine tender. So the idea that you could locate both air assets on the island and then undersea assets from the island. And what matters is when your ability to deny or project power was based on the range of an unrefueled aircraft, which was the case in the 1940s and 1950s, then this island really matters, right? What has changed since then is this advent of long-range missiles and fencing, which once you are no longer worried about kind of the radius of an unrefuelable aircraft as your primary means of projecting military effects or denying operation to your enemy, right? then one particular geographic point like an island doesn't matter as much, right? So the idea that the extra range this provides your aircraft is pretty minimal. And also the extra range it provides for your submarines is also pretty modest. And I spent a lot of time talking about the undersea aspect of Taiwan in the possession of the People's Republic of China, because ultimately the undersea campaign for the larger competition for the Pacific is going to be the most important aspect in terms of military competition, at least for the next, I'd say, generational weapons. Right now, the United States has an enormous undersea advantage. If you go to my colleagues at the China Maritime Studies Institute at the Naval War College, my colleague Ryan Martinson just published an excellent analysis of some translated work that looked at the Chinese own assessments of its undersea disadvantage. And so this idea that Taiwan is actually quite well located because it's on the continental shelf, right? So it looks out at deep water from its east coast. And there are some things you can locate on the east coast if you could actually militarize it and build ports there that are much bigger than what exists now. You can actually create some military effects in the larger Pacific. And what I did was I actually just looked at the numbers based on open source modeling that previous scholars have used. And while it is true that China could locate submarines on its east coast, it's still not that difficult to detect them and then to prosecute them, to make the number of missiles or torpedoes that can be thrown into the fight military significant compared to kind of the other modes of attack that are available to the PRC.
So you mentioned a few minutes ago this idea that the United States should consider trying to make Taiwan the pacing scenario for China, but not necessarily be the pacing scenario for the United States. And, I've read for several years now across successive administrations, the idea of China as the pacing challenge, Taiwan as the pacing scenario, and then even more recently, some reporting from the Washington Post on some interim national defense strategic guidance from the administration that talks about a fait accompli attack on Taiwan as the pacing scenario. So sort of one subset of scenarios that we could have with respect to Taiwan. So not to take that necessarily at face value or to ask you to comment on that, but I've written in Lawfare and a couple other places about the concern that in a security environment as complex as the Indo-Pacific, overly narrowing the pacing scenario, policymakers have to prioritize. We have to prioritize how we think about defense investments, planning, et cetera. But there is a concern that historically, great powers have often ended up fighting wars other than the one they planned for. And so there's this concern about overly narrowing pacing scenarios. And I think your piece, it sounded like from what you said earlier, that you had some thoughts about how to approach just in general from this analysis. Like you've learned some things that tell us a little bit about how we might want to approach this question of the DoD's pacing scenario and how we think about the Taiwan problem in that context. Do you have any thoughts or any insights that this article brought to you that you think would be helpful for policymakers to know or to have in their back pocket as they're making these plans and thinking through these problems?
When I started talking about the pacing scenario, that was actually driven not really by current administrative policy, whether it's Biden or Trump, but it's this idea of what is the thing that you base your military around. And in the article, I quote a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-PACOM in the first Trump administration, who basically says, Taiwan's the Fulda Gap, right? And for those who remember the Cold War, the Fulda Gap was this point in the middle of Germany that was kind of the pivot around which we thought the entire ground campaign between the Warsaw Pact and NATO was going to revolve around. And it focused planning on solving that problem. And that's the classic example of the pacing threat. Another classic example of the pacing threat would be kind of France's response to the potential invasion from Germany, which is the Maginot Line. And as Sheena, you just noted, that didn't work out so well either. So there's risk in choosing your pacing threat. But I also want to say I'm very sympathetic to the need for a pacing scenario and a pacing threat, because the Department of Defense has to focus a very complicated enterprise of combatant commands, services who all have their own independent analytical capability, own independent bureaucratic incentives. And you have to create something that everyone agrees on, so you can decide whether to buy stealth bombers or aircraft carriers or a certain type of missile or a certain type of satellite. And we all have to agree on that. And so the pacing threat is very consequential, very important. And if I'm, let's just say, the tactics from the previous administration and the Navy starts saying, you know what, I don't think Taiwan should be the pacing scenario because, we have to do all these other missions. I think, you know what, the Navy just wants to keep its carriers. And so now it's changing the rules of the game, right? And so I want to point out to listeners that like pacing scenarios are really important, right? But you have to really think through the consequences and then how much of the effort you want to focus on that pacing scenario. And so what I argue in this article is if you look at the range of conflict between the pacing threat, which is China, and the possible missions that the United States military would have to conduct in a military conflict against China, which is, of course, what we have to do if we want to deter China from doing certain things. The invasion of Taiwan is really important, right? But it's also very specific, right? And so the more you focus on that one pacing scenario, the less you're going to work on the other, which I think are much more plausible and much more important set of scenarios that you have to prepare against. And so I think there's two ways to think about a pacing scenario. As I talked to you, Sheena, and your question really made me think a little harder about this. One is, what is the pacing scenario, right? And then the second one is, how important is the pacing scenario, right? Is it 100% of your effort? Is it 80% of your effort? That's probably just as important a decision as identifying what the actual scenario is.
Thanks. I think that's a really helpful way to think about it. And it gets back to this idea that these are decisions ultimately that rest with the president and with their national security team. And so the role of scholarship in that case is to try to give them as informed sense of the risks and trade-offs of the different options in front of them as we possibly can. These are questions we think a lot and discuss a lot amongst ourselves at TNSR. So it's great to hear your perspective informed by the varied experience you've had. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Thanks for joining us on Horns of a Dilemma from the Texas National Security Review. Our guest today has been Jon Caverley, author of the article, So What? Reassessing the Military Implications of Chinese Control of Taiwan, which as always can be accessed for free on our website, tnsr.org. Jon, thank you very much for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen. We love hearing from you. You can find more of our work at tnsr.org. Today's episode was produced by TNSR Digital and Technical Manager Jordan Morning and made possible by the University of Texas. This is Ryan Vest and Sheena Chestnut Greitens. Thank you for listening.